I'm John Goddard. I'm Vice Chair of Sustainability at L.E.K Consulting. I lead our Sustainability Center of Excellence, which brings together our capabilities across our sectors and our geographies in order to enable our partners to speak effectively and confidently around sustainability. I've advised at board level for over 20 years across Europe and in North America, and really delighted to have this opportunity to speak with you today. Okay. Ilya, did you want to say something? Now that I got the clicker working.
Thank you, John. Yes, my pleasure to join the group here. Ilya Trakhtenberg. I'm a partner and managing director with L.E.K Consulting. Been with the firm for more than a dozen years, focusing on healthcare and based in the Chicago office. One of the hats that I wear is having the privilege of serving on our Sustainability Center of Excellence board of directors. Been doing that for the last couple of years, and one of my goals in being part of that initiative within L.E.K is to really figure out how we can bring sustainability initiatives into healthcare and better understand where there are opportunities for healthcare to make an impact, and to figure out how to navigate the relatively complex topic. My focus areas are particularly in the world of medtech and healthcare supply chain, which is a practice I lead here in the Americas. Back to you, John.
Well, let's get into it. So I will start by sharing with you our observations on how leading companies are tackling sustainability, the challenges they are facing in achieving their goals, and will conclude by providing some pointers for how these can be addressed and overcome. Ilya will continue the discussion by providing you our observations on the trends in the healthcare sector and examples of progress across leading market participants. We will dig into the topic of Scope 3 emissions and what this means for the healthcare supply chain, and conclude on observations to consider for SMI. We aim to finish our talk within around 45 minutes, so that should leave us around 10 minutes or so for questions. But first, some broader context. Over the last 2 years, we have seen how organizations have increased the pace at which they are establishing their sustainability agendas. Not only do management teams increasingly realize that what can be good for the planet and society can be also good for business, but there are a number of powerful external forces behind these moves. If we start with the consumer, we undertook in 2022 research that showed that in the US, approximately 50% of consumers have switched brands or products due to sustainability, environmental, or ethical concerns. Our analysis also showed that currently sustainability marketed consumer products are delivering more than over half of all market growth, even though they make up less than 20% of the overall market size. On the investor side, we are witnessing a very dynamic landscape, with about a third of all funds claiming some form of sustainability stance. And within those, the strictest definition, there are nearly $2.5 trillion with a pure sustainability focus. The regulators have been busy, and we expect this to continue over the medium term. For instance, here in the UK, we have the TCFD corporate reporting requirements, the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and as we are aware, the proposals coming from the SEC over tighter reporting, particularly around emissions. Until quite recently, an overlooked group of stakeholders are our employees. The fallout from the pandemic and the generational shifts has brought sustainability to the top of the talent agenda. And it's clear that employees are increasingly prioritizing working for organizations with sustainability values that align with their own. And we observe that strong sustainability goals and policies can serve as a competitive advantage in the war for talent. The corporate sustainability agenda is broad and deep, with environmental, social, and governance factors challenging senior management boards to make difficult trade-offs and new strategic choices. There is much more focus, rightly, on emissions reduction, and publicly listed companies around the world have been making strong commitments. Some 82% of the FTSE 100 have committed to net zero by 2050, and more than 700 of the largest 2,000 publicly traded companies globally have made similar pledges. And there has been a 52% increase in the number of Fortune 500 companies with net zero targets in the last 12 months. Companies are also demonstrating a strong intent behind sustainability and ESG strategies, and this was confirmed in our recent corporate sustainability research we undertook at the end of last year amongst C-suite executives in the US, Germany, France, the UK, China, and Australia. We found that the majority of executives we spoke to consider sustainability as a growth or innovation driver for their business. In fact, 71% did, being made up of 51% who see it as a growth driver and 20% who see it as driving an innovation-led approach. We found it very interesting that more than half of executives in publicly listed companies stated that they were willing to trade off short-term financial performance if it benefited longer-term sustainability factors. Organizations see the number one priority over the medium term as investment in more sustainable products and services. So the commitment of our major businesses to becoming more sustainable and progressing the ESG agenda is strong. But how are they doing? We observe that in many companies are finding it quite challenging to achieve their ESG targets and goals. For instance, despite the commitment and intent, a significant number of the largest global manufacturing companies are struggling to progress their emissions ambitions. A few data points bring this to life. While 82 of the FTSE 100 we spoke about earlier have committed to net zero, so far only 40 of these organizations have aligned with the Science Based Targets initiative, which is generally considered as the gold standard for validating company emission reduction plans. And therefore 60% having yet to establish clear net zero roadmaps that investors and third parties can take comfort from. The trend is the same if we look in the Fortune 500, where some just 34% have committed to SBTi. 25 of the world's most valuable companies with over $3.2 trillion in combined revenues have climate plans that in a recent report by the New Climate Institute and Carbon Market Watch were deemed to be weaker than marketed. We therefore observe that progress has been quite challenging for some of our most significant global businesses, and we wanted to find out why. Our global corporate sustainability survey, which I referenced earlier, and you'll have the ability to download at the end of this webinar, uncovered a number of fascinating insights as to the main challenges and barriers organizations are facing as they seek to progress on their sustainability journeys. The most single significant barrier to delivering an organization's long-term sustainability ambition is, in the view of our C-suite respondents, a lack of strategic alignment across key stakeholders, including the board, executives, divisional heads, and investors. And probing further, we find that less than half of those interviewed felt that they have an executive team and board that are strongly aligned on their sustainability priorities. In addition, we heard that almost half are struggling to balance the interests of different groups, such as the communities in which they operate and serve and their shareholders. So, no wonder organizations, including some of our largest companies globally, are struggling to achieve the desired progress implied by having high-level sustainability commitments they are making. In our experience, and I'm sure many of you would agree, that when there is no clear strategic alignment at the top of a company or division, it makes the effective implementation of any strategy very difficult. Misalignment on sustainability and ESG can often manifest itself in an apparent commitment to a vision and a set of goals at a high level, but the organization finds it much more challenging to develop the required ESG and sustainability positive initiatives. For instance, an emissions reduction roadmap, gender pay equivalence plans, and an effective diversity program. Our research also shows that it's not just alignment that's holding organizations back. As this slide shows, the research identified three further factors holding back the delivery of sustainability goals. Firstly, while the vast majority of executives feel pressure from investors to increase the level of ESG reporting, over just a quarter of the organizations told us they had any enterprise level KPIs. And just a mere 3% admitted to having a full suite of KPIs in place for all ESG and sustainability priorities. So if you agree with the management adage, courtesy of Peter Drucker, that what gets measured gets managed, then there is little surprise that a significant number of organizations are making limited progress in achieving their ESG goals and targets. Incorporating sustainability and ESG goals into strategy has clearly made decision-making and investment choices that much more difficult. And while we heard that just over half of executives felt that addressing ESG issues should take precedent over short-term performance, we also found that nearly 60% said that their leadership team disagreed on how to balance short-term priorities with longer-term goals. The third factor holding organizations back is accountability, and particularly not having the right reward framework to drive behavior. 43% of executives we spoke to were concerned that their existing remuneration frameworks were inadequate and in particular lacked alignment of leadership pay with the progress against sustainability goals. That is not to say that there are not organizations who have effectively embraced linking executive remuneration to reward progress, but relative to other performance measures using compensation mechanisms, linking to progressing ESG goals has a considerable way to go. So how do the organizations need to address these challenges? Further insight can be derived by looking at where successful organizations have made some progress. Through our research and engagement with a range of public and private companies, we have identified 7 dimensions which successful organizations focus on. I will highlight 3 areas in particular. Firstly, integrating sustainability into strategy. We find that successful organizations are not managing sustainability as a discrete set of activities, but rather an integrated set of strategic choices, embracing a clear vision and goals, along with the key where to play, how to win, organized, and getting it done choices. Establishing the right culture is critical. While this is linked to an organization's purpose, one aspect of culture that is really important for a company to establish is a sustainable mindset. For instance, in R&D and product development, making it a key priority to future-proofing a business's products and services by building in sustainability at the design and prototype stage. Sustainability and ESG goals have made supply chain management much more strategic, and we're going to hear more about this when Ilya speaks. And this in turn requires an increased level of sophistication, given the impact that supply chain has on an organization's ability to achieve its own sustainability goals, be it Scope 3 emissions, labor practices, or raw material sourcing. We find that successful companies understand in detail the impact of their supply chain goals on their supply chain partners, and hence how to engage proactively and intervene in order to further the company's own objectives. Before I hand over to Ilya, I'd like to share a 5-point plan for action that any organization can adopt to give it a better chance of delivering on its sustainability goals and strategy. The plan seeks to address the key challenges we have identified from our discussions with senior executives, as well as the experience of the most successful companies. Firstly, it is critical for senior management and boards to drive strategic alignment across the organization. And as highlighted, there are two really important aspects: being sure to establish a common language for sustainability initiatives. This is important at the board level, at the executive team level, and with divisional management, and then cascading this through the organization. The second aspect involves developing a clear vision and goals for the organization, embracing sustainability, and then identifying the key strategic choices required to achieve these goals, particularly the where to play and how to win choices. Having identified the strategic choices, prioritize those that support and accelerate the organization's sustainability goals in areas such as a company's product portfolio, brand positioning, innovation, and operations. This is where organizations need to analyze the financial and non-financial benefits of each choice that helps achieve the stated goals. Involving the full leadership team in this activity helps build and reinforce alignment. The third element of the plan is to create an agile organization that can respond to the new and challenging demands that sustainability brings. In doing so, make sure that the required skills and capabilities are identified and, to the extent needed, addressed and upgraded through training and recruitment. The final two elements of the plan, we believe, are critical and address measurement and accountability, which you heard me emphasize earlier in the presentation, and they work most effectively when combined. It is critical to establish clear KPIs. Organizations need to define what is required to achieve their goals and strategies, be it energy usage, supplier emissions, gender pay, diversity, women in leadership, employee training, whatever the KPIs. Set those KPIs that will allow progress to be tracked, measured, and reported frequently. Finally, we would strongly recommend aligning compensation to the new KPIs to incentivize and reward performance and progress towards sustainability and ESG goals. I hope you found some of the insights that I've shared from our research and perspectives on how to implement an effective sustainability strategy helpful. I will now hand over to Ilya, who will share some fascinating insights and perspectives on how the healthcare companies and organizations are progressing towards their sustainability goals and strategies.
Thank you, John. I will try to make it fascinating as you put it. Thank you very much for sharing. I think it's very helpful context for everyone to see what's happening more broadly globally and what are some of the drivers of the different developments we've been seeing on the sustainability front over the last several years. I'll help bring this a little bit closer to home to some of the healthcare companies that are involved, especially in the US market. We'll start, let me flip the slide forward. Oh, there we go. We'll start by discussing a little bit about the sustainability initiatives that have been evident so far in the healthcare ecosystem. Obviously, there's a lot of different types of organizations that have very different organizational structures, footprints, operating models, et cetera. So there are some aspects that are relatively more important around sustainability for some ecosystem participants than for others. I think the broader point is that we have seen a significant number of organizations starting to talk about sustainability, setting goals for sustainability, et cetera. And there are some common themes. I mean, in general, across the landscape, you can see in this Venn diagram, reducing the carbon footprint is the stated objective for most organizations. There are some more specific trends that we do see evident for different ecosystem participants, as I mentioned, reflecting their unique positions and approaches. So on the healthcare provider side, for example, cutting medical waste is a fairly common target metric and approach for getting involved in sustainability. Similarly, thinking about how do we incorporate sustainability into procurement decisions. We'll talk a little bit more about a specific example of that with the UK's NHS later on in our discussion. On the supplier side, medtechs and distributors, some good examples are finding ways to recycle and or adjust product materials or packaging to reduce the carbon footprint that those contribute to. On the pharma side, there are similar considerations, but there's a very different infrastructure and supply chain network that is managed relative to medtechs, for example. So a whole host of other different types of priorities that are manifesting for pharma companies. Bottom line is there are a lot of common themes, but there are also nuances that require sustainability to be thought about from a unique lens for each of the different market participants within the healthcare sector. And when we take a look within the US ecosystem, and some of these organizations are obviously global in nature too, we do see that many leading healthcare providers and suppliers have been sharing sustainability goals and commitments. And and some of them have been very specific, some of them have been a bit broader. There's a few examples here that we highlighted just for the sake of having diversity of different kinds of examples. If you look at a company like Medtronic, they've had a pretty robust reporting that they've been putting out on sustainability. And there are some pretty specific goals that have also been shared around scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions reductions. They've actually set a goal of getting to net zero emissions by fiscal year 2045. And some of that is evidenced with specific goals around reducing energy intensity by 20% in the near term, I think by 2025, or reducing waste intensity by 15% by 2025. So there's some specific goals that organizations have been setting like that. There are other examples, like on the provider side. Northwell has set up its various sustainability efforts and shared through its reports some specific goals as well. And there are things like increasing recycling volume by 25% by 2027, or again reducing electricity usage by 10% over the next few years. Setting some of the longer term goals is something that many of these organizations are also working on. And I think another good example is Cardinal, that has essentially set specific goals for reducing scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 50% from kind of the 2019 year base, and trying to achieve that by 2030. Some of these organizations are further along in terms of committing to setting specific goals in line with Science-Based Targets Initiative, the SBTi. We'll talk a little bit more about some of these things in the coming slides. But I think the broader point is there's a lot of different progress being made and announcements being made by different market participants, both on the healthcare provider side and on the supplier side. Now, I think it is important to note that many organizations have recognized that sustainability should, in one way or another, be incorporated into their considerations. Some have made it a key priority. Others have not made it as kind of high level of a priority, but have certainly spoken to incorporating it and finding ways to become more sustainable and aligned with some of these goals that we've been talking about. I would say that the level of you know, announced commitments and statements that there is interest and effort underway has been relatively high. But the progress that's been made has been fairly limited. And I think the other important takeaway there is the amount of activity has been quite variable. Some organizations have made quite a bit of progress and done quite a lot. Others are not nearly as far along in their journey, or necessarily have very much clarity around what that journey needs to look like. I think the other observation that's linked to what John was speaking about is that healthcare is not quite as far along as some other sectors in incorporating sustainability, both into strategy and into day-to-day operations. Some of that makes sense because it's a more regulated industry. It is also a fairly complex industry. But there's other reasons too that may be pretty self-evident. I mean, we're not as directly impacted of an industry by consumer preferences, nor can we adapt things as quickly. And there are some in industries that are clearly targets of sustainability investors like oil and gas, which makes it a bit more, I would say, urgent to have a response. But regardless of how you look at it, there's a lot of increasing interest. There's some progress being made in healthcare. And it's important to start thinking about what does this mean for your organization, at least from our perspective. One of the things that often gets talked about is the different types of emissions and scopes 1, 2, and 3. I think it's very helpful to set the same language and make sure everybody understands what we're talking about when we do discuss sustainability and reductions in emissions. We're really talking about reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. And the definitions of scope 1, 2, and 3 are shared here and tried to be visualized. Scope 1 is, think of it as the most proximal to your organization. These are direct emissions from owned or controlled sources where it is within your organization, within your direct control. The second scope is kind of the next circle out from that. It's indirect emissions that are generally from the generation of purchased energy. So energy that you buy, you choose where you're purchasing it from or have some control over that, but it is indirect emissions. The third, and one that we'll spend some more time speaking about today, is relatively more challenging, and it is scope 3. Scope 3 is really the indirect emissions that are generated throughout the entire value chain, both upstream and downstream from the organization. As you might imagine, you have quite limited control for many organizations around what happens both upstream and downstream. And even beyond having limited control, there's limited visibility. So one of the biggest challenges that we see presently for many organizations is how to navigate not just finding some of the quicker wins or nearer term opportunities with scope 1 and scope 2, but what do you do about this scope 3 topic? On this slide, we wanted to talk a little bit more about scope 3 and what exactly is happening with scope 3 and how important is it to even be setting any goals or be thinking about a strategy for trying to identify opportunities to impact scope 3 emissions. There are 3 broad drivers that we're seeing of greater attention that will likely continue on for the foreseeable future. The first is around regulation. John spoke about this at the outset of our discussion today. And you do see that in major geographies like the US and EU, there are a variety of regulations that are being worked on related to scope 3. The UK has made some specific reporting and disclosure requirements already. And it's, this is something that will continue to be an area of evolution over the next several years, but one that shouldn't be taken lightly as organizations think about what kind of reporting they must do for various stakeholders. The second driver is the availability and voluntary inclusion of organizations within different climate disclosure frameworks. There has been a lot of efforts to create some kind of standards and have mechanisms for being able to define goals and set goals, especially around scope 3. SBTI is the gold standard accreditation for climate commitments and usually includes scope 3 as a target. So I think the learning there is that a lot of there are frameworks that have become available for organizations to use, and that enables more of that reporting that we just talked about that is tied to regulation. It also is something that isn't purely regulator related, but also, you know, there's a certain expectation from various stakeholders that you start making use of these frameworks and make commitments. We saw some of the members of this organization have made commitments, and there's a variety of different publications that, you know, different organizations have put out on this topic. The third, and you know, I think this is a pretty critical one. The third driver here is stakeholders, and there's a lot of different stakeholders that are impacted here. We're certainly seeing, and you know, you read about this in the press, pressure from investors on achieving sustainability goals or setting a sustainability goals. This definitely includes scope 3, but there are other types of stakeholders that are critical. Now, one is customers. I mean, we'll talk about the NHS example I alluded to, and how they're thinking about procurement decisions and how that impacts anybody who supplies to them. But suppliers are also requesting scope 3 emissions data increasingly. And customers, obviously, and consumers are asking for this. Now, patients might not ask that frequently, but it is becoming something more important to most patients. I think one of the most important and perhaps overlooked parts here is actually around employees. And John talked about how this is sustainability is becoming a bigger and more important topic for attracting and retaining talent. We do think that is an important component here of what is driving interest and the desire to find ways to not just deal with scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but some of the longer term scope 3 emissions. And we'll talk about it shortly, but scope 3 emissions do account for the vast majority for most organizations. On the next slide here, I did want to mention kind of what's this set of challenges that we do see with scope 3. And there are quite a number. I think some of them are pretty obvious, but you know, on the upstream side, when you think about going upstream in the value chain and products and services that are purchased, there are a variety of complexities in dealing with this, because when first being able to measure emissions is challenging. There's an awful lot of sources. There's a lot of different organizations. There could be hundreds, thousands of organizations that you are involved with, and understanding all of their emissions is obviously quite challenging and tedious, and their reporting capabilities are highly variable too. There are a lot of assumptions that can be used, but there's also a lot of inaccuracies that result. Engaging effectively with supply chain partners beyond a narrow set of, I would say, tier 1 suppliers can be quite challenging and burdensome as well. So there's a variety of kind of challenges on the upstream side. There's some others listed here too. On the downstream side, there are some similar challenges. You know, understanding the sources, especially average in-use emissions across different applications of products, or, you know, depending on what or services that are being provided, it's actually quite challenging to understand and to quantify some of the specifics related to downstream use. The other aspect that is often a challenge here is around understanding, you know, how customers are behaving, their preferences, and how changes to what you might do to alter scope 3 emissions might have an impact on. The last piece here is just purely internal. I think John spoke at some length on this, but there are a variety of challenges and to overcome internally to be able to pursue any kind of meaningful reductions in scope 3. Some of them are around, you know, having uncertainties over the cost and the technical feasibility of different carbon reduction levers. Some of it is around just having the right capabilities to be able to actually push through any of these initiatives, even as simple as altering, you know, requirements from procurement. That can be very tedious, very challenging, and have a host of different implications that one didn't expect. There are some other considerations, and John spoke to this too, but understanding commercial trade-offs when you're making decisions that could meaningfully reduce scope 3 emissions, it may have meaningful implications on other aspects of the business and trade-offs that are financial in nature too. So anyhow, point is there's a lot of challenges when it comes to trying to address scope 3 emissions. Hopefully that isn't, I don't want to leave you with a completely, hopeless viewpoint on this topic. And for that reason, we did put together some thoughts on what we've seen as some best practices across sectors that organizations are onboarding in order to pursue some of the goals that they've set, especially on scope 3 emissions. I will note that some of these are much more significant, much longer term and more challenging typically, and some are much narrower and more focused and can be achieved in the nearer term. One example is business model innovation. These are things that could be, changing the lifespan of products or changing logistics or the way that products come to market, for example. Another lever that is often used is around supplier engagement and identifying suppliers to engage and work with to reduce, to reduce emissions, and especially monitoring progress and creating incentives in order to do that. There are a host of other examples here. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these columns, but there are some around procurement choices, which we discussed. There are some around design of products and creating a more circular economy approach to recycled products, or what do you do with single-use products? Are there opportunities to recycle, for example? There are also broader questions on investment strategy, for example, to think about how do you incorporate sustainability considerations into investments. I think the broader point is there are a lot of different levers to consider. Some of them are big, some of them are small. And while it is relatively challenging to pursue scope 3 emissions reductions, and most organizations, not just in healthcare, are not very far along on this path, there are mechanisms and tools to be able to start going down that path. I thought it might be helpful to bring some of this discussion to life. There's one good example that we pulled from the UK's National Health Services. The NHS, as many of you know, is a very large-scale healthcare organization that has a very big mandate in terms of providing and caring for the people of the UK. It does often provide an interesting analog and window into what healthcare companies can be doing and are doing, especially on this topic. Now, this visual here that we show on the left-hand side is an estimate that the NHS has created around their own greenhouse gas emissions by scope. One observation you can immediately see is that scope 1, which is the lightest green on top, and scope 2, which is the middle, the mid-green right underneath it, they're a relatively small percentage of the total. In fact, only about 20% of the emissions are coming from scope 1 and scope 2, and 80% from scope 3. So you can see why I spent a little bit more time talking about scope 3 just now. The other interesting analysis that they had conducted is here on the right-hand side, trying to break apart the sources of scope 3 emissions. Now, these are, granted, very broad, large categories. But you can see that about a third of emissions are coming from what they call medicines and chemicals, but think of it as pharma and other chemical substances used in care delivery, for example, anesthesia agents. Another third is actually coming from equipment, about half of that from medical equipment, about half from non-medical equipment, other equipment. You can see that there's a big bucket of other that's about 40% as well. So there's a long tail as well. But it is interesting to start seeing how they've started to analyze this and the kind of results that they've seen. One of the key levers that the NHS has pulled initially, as we talked about, there's procurement decisions, and the ability to source sustainably is something that can be considered and has been by some organizations. The NHS created a supplier assessment framework that they're using for procurement of and purchasing of goods and services. And this is an important component of their broader plan. They call this the Evergreen Sustainable Supplier Assessment. I thought this might be an interesting kind of lens to look at the world. You can see that there is a minimum threshold that's expected of all suppliers, but then there are increasingly higher thresholds of what a supplier needs to do in order to get higher up on this triangle, if you will, and that it goes from it goes from actually stating what some of your commitments are, all the way to being recognized as a leader who is really linking up with NHS's ambitions and is independently verifying targets and showing that they have a plan to make progress. One question that might come up, I don't have a good answer for it at this point, is how do they use this framework relative to other more traditional frameworks? And that is it's a good question. I do think there is a kind of strategic question around how much weight do you put on this versus traditional factors of selection of a supplier. Obviously, this doesn't replace many of the considerations that one must have for a supplier. The last kind of aspect of this case study that I wanted to share is just how the NHS has been thinking about their net zero roadmap and how there are kind of certain milestones along that path that they have identified. One, they have set a net zero goal by 2045. What they've recognized, I think, quite clearly in this roadmap is most of their suppliers are not anywhere near being able to hit kind of some of these targets or show meaningful reductions, especially on scope 3 anytime soon, or immediately at least. So you can see that, by 2023, for example, one of the stipulations is that any contract over £5 million requires that a supplier has some kind of a published carbon reduction plan. And for the first handful of years, you can see that it's all about sharing that you have plans, that you're showing commitment. By 2027, that kind of ramps up to, are you actually providing reporting? Are you showing reporting on emissions and any progress you're making on that carbon reduction plan? By 2030, that's when there's actual stipulations around being able to demonstrate and quantify reductions. Now we'll see if this plan changes, but this is how they've kind of pursued this, and it is an interesting example and analog to consider.